Today we're going to talk about how to find tangent or sinus or cosinus of angles that are not on a trig circle. So if you look at this one, for example, if you want to find tangent of pi over 12, well, could we say that we're going to do tangent of pi over 6 and then divide by 2? So I like to visualize what we're doing. So pi over 12, if you think about it, this is the same as pi over 6 that we divide by 2. Because remember, when we divide by 2, and this is 2 over 1, when we divide a fraction, we can also say that we multiply by the reciprocal. So that would give us our pi over 12. So if you visualize in the circle, imagine your trig circle, pi over 6 is around here, because remember we can have 6 of that in pi, okay, and our pi is over here. So pi over 6 is here. Pi over 12 means that would be half of that, so it would be around here. Oh, sorry, something like that. So if you remember, sine is the y value. So, or tangent, we would have to find sine over cos. So let's see what happens if you take your calculator and you calculate here tangent of pi over 6 divided by 2. You get something like 0.288. If you take your calculator and you do tangent of pi over 12, remember on your calculator to put your bracket here, you do pi divided by 12, you're going to get something like 0.267. So it's not exactly the same. So we're not able to do it like this. So you're going to be learning a few formulas to do addition and subtraction of sine, cosine, and tangent. So the formulas look like this. I'm going to look at the first one just to show how it works. So if I'm looking for sine of a plus b here, then it's going to be sine of a cosine of b plus sine of b cosine of a. Now, if I want to do a subtraction, then I'm going to be subtracting on this side as well. So for sine, it's pretty easy because it's the same symbol. And you need to alternate sine, cos, and the letters. Now, if you did with cosine, you have to be careful because if you're doing an addition here, there is a subtraction on this side. And for cosine, it's cosine A cosine B minus sine A sine B. And for tangent, it's a little bit more complex. There's a division, there's a plus up here, and we divide by a minus. So these formulas, you should write them down and you're going to be able to use them. Now we're looking for, let's say, pi over 12. So let's start with what we know. So the ones that we know that are easy, we know pi over 2. Pi over 2, if we put it over 12, if we want to change this over 12, we need to times here by 6. So if we do that at the bottom, we're going to do that at the top. So here we're going to have 6 pi. If we know pi over 3 on our trig circle, if we put that over 12, we need to times by 4 at the bottom. So it's going to be 4 pi. We also know pi over 4. Pi over 4, if we put that over 12, at the bottom we need to times by 3. So at the top we need to times by 3. And then we realize that here I have 4 pi over 12 and 3 pi over 12. So if I minus these two, then I'm going to get my pi over 12. So you could say that pi over 12 is equal to 4 pi over 12 minus pi over 3. Sorry, 3 pi over 12. Sorry. And so that equals our pi over 12. And if you simplify these two, then you know pi over 12 is equal to pi over 3 minus pi over 4. So let's go back to our question. Well, actually, we're not going to go back to the same question. We're going to be looking at sine of 7 pi over 12. So I put up there the formula just so we remember. And if we go back just quickly to see if we're looking for 7 pi over 12, we can again take these two, but we're going to add them up. If we add 4 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12, we get our 7 pi over 12. So you could write it like this. You could write sine of 7 pi over 12 is equal to sine of 4 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12, like this. And this we can simplify. So it gives us sine of pi over 3 plus pi over 4. And then you can use the formula up here. If we want to add two signs, we're going to do sine of the first one, cosine of the second one, plus sine of the second one, cosine of the first one. So let's write that down here. Equal. So I want to find sine of the first one, cosine of the second one, plus sine of the second one, cosine of the first one. Now, what is the value of sine and cosine of these two? You have to remember, think about your trig circle here. If you think about your trig circle, you know that pi over 4 is right here. Sorry, that's pi over 3. Pi over 4 is right about here in the middle. And what are the coordinate of that is square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. And remember that the first coordinate is always cosine. So that's cosine of pi over 4. And the second one is sine of pi over 4. And for the second one here, if we're looking for this one at pi over 3, the coordinate is 1/2 and square root of 3 over 2. So you have to remember the first one is cosine. So that's cosine of pi over 3. And this is sine of pi over 3. So now you just have to substitute the values in your equation. So here, sine of pi over 3, I'm coming here, sine of pi over 3 is this value. So it's square root of 3 over 2. So that is equal, times cosine of pi over 4. Cosine of pi over 4 is the first here coordinate. So that's square root of 2 over 2 plus sine of pi over 4 is on the right up here. Again, it's square root of 2 over 2. And cosine of pi over 3 is the first coordinate up here, is 1/2. Now you remember when you multiply fraction, you multiply the top with the top. So that's square root of 6 over 4 plus square root of 2. And it's also over 4. So you could just put a big line like this and put your 4 in the middle. That would be your answer. So obviously it's not easy to always find, like this in this example it was 7 pi over 12. What are the numbers that make up that number? But you need to practice a little bit and play around with the numbers. So one more question. If I'm asking you, is this equation true? Sine of pi over 4 plus pi over 3 is equal to sine pi over 4 plus sine pi over 3. So on this case here, the angles are added, and here the sines are added. So what is your first guess? You think that's going to be equal? So if you think about that, this here is what we just did, sine of pi over 4 plus pi over 3. It was the same as sine of 7 pi over 12, right? And we just did the calculation. You can type it on your calculator also. It gives you 0.9659, around that. And what does it mean? Imagine you have a trig circle. Pi is over here. You would need to divide your circle in 12 equal parts. So I know this is 6, so 12 would look like this. Oh, sorry, something like this, and the same here. So like this, and then again in 2. So that would be pi over 12, and 7 pi would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 pi is here, 7 pi over 12. So the sign means the y value. So this is the value. It gives us 0.96. Does it make sense? Of course, because on the top here, we know that this is 0, 1. So we know that the top is 1. So 0.9 for this makes sense. If we calculate sine of pi over 4, this is square root of 2 over 2, plus sine of pi over 3, it's square root of 3 over 2. So remember that if you have square root of 2 times square root of 3, we get square root of 6. But in this case here, when you times, you can do that. But when you add, there's nothing you can do really. You have to leave it like that. You have to leave it square root of 2 plus square root of 3 over 2. If you take your calculator and you add that up, you get something around 1.57. So these two are not equal. So be careful in the calculation you're making. Have fun now.